Friday Forum talk here today. Kenneth Townsend can't be with us, so I'm kind of doing double duty to introduce the series and the speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Mike Fontaine is a professor of classics at Cornell University, a 1998 grad of Millsaps College, classics major, Lambda Chi, Ford Fellow, right here. He received his PhD from Brown University. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Funny Words in Plautine Comedy. He's also one of the two editors of the Oxford Handbook of Greek and Roman Comedy. He will be talking with us today about one of my favorite ancient Roman comedies called the Menaechmus Brothers. In his talk today, entitled On Being Sane in an Insane Place, the Rosenhan Experiment in the Laboratory of Roman Comedy.
Hi everybody, this is, can you hear me? Yeah. This is a huge honor and pleasure for me to be back here. It is the second time I lectured on this stage. The first time was in 1997 as a Ford Fellow. As you heard, if any of you are doing that program, it works. It's fantastic. And I haven't been back to Millsaps in a long time, but boy, do I envy all of you that are still students here. It's really great. So thank you for having me. I do want to, I'm going to be talking about an ancient comedy very long ago, 2,200 years ago. But I want to start on a more serious note because it is a more serious thing I'm talking about. And in particular, I'm going to be talking a little bit about mental illness. So some observers say that we have a problem here in America. Mental health in the United States, in their view, has reached a crisis point. Take a look. 1 in every 6 Americans is now taking an antidepressant or other psychiatric drug. And they're taking them for long-term use. Among women, that number is 1 in 4 at least. At least 1 in 4 women is taking one of these pills. Think about that for a second. That means every single one of us here in the room either takes one of these pills or gives them to a relative or knows somebody who's doing that. So what's going on as you look at this situation? Why is that number so sensationally high? Is it the case that as our science and our technology and our training is improving, the doctors are getting better and better and better at diagnosing mental illness? Well, maybe not. It turns out that psychiatry, the field that we look to for help in treating mental illness, is reaching a crisis point of its own. So controversy has recently been engulfing what's called the DSM-5. Here it is. It's the 5th revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It's called the DSM. The DSM is the Bible, they call it, of professional psychiatrists. And there's a crisis of confidence about whether the diagnoses of mental illness recorded in its scriptures are real, or whether they're metaphors or something else. In a 2010 essay in Wired magazine, the American psychotherapist and popular writer Gary Greenberg explained the root problem. He says, the authority of any doctor depends on their ability to name a patient's suffering. For patients to accept a diagnosis, they must believe that the doctors know in the same way that physicists know about gravity or biologists about mitosis, that their disease exists and that they have it. But this kind of certainty has eluded psychiatry, and every fight over nomenclature, over names, threatens to undermine the legitimacy of the profession by revealing its dirty secret, that for all their confident pronouncements, psychiatrists cannot rigorously differentiate illness from everyday suffering. This is why, as one psychiatrist wrote after the APA voted homosexuality out of the DSM, quote, there is a terrible sense of shame among psychiatrists, always wanting to show that our diagnoses are as good as the scientific ones used in real medicine. So what he calls this terrible sense of shame has a longer history than you might think. 45 years ago, this very problem that engenders it was put to a sort of clinical test. That test is today known as the Rosenhan experiment. Anybody heard of this in psychology class? Its findings have become a standard feature in introductory textbooks of psychology and psychiatry. In 1972, Stanford psychologist David Rosenhan sought to demonstrate that diagnoses of mental illness lack validity. He did this by having 8 what he called pseudo-patients of which he was one, feign auditory hallucinations to gain admission to psychiatric hospitals. Once they were admitted to the 12 institutions they approached, the pseudo-patients acted entirely normally. Yet all were nevertheless judged insane by psychiatrists. So ironically, while the psychiatrists judged these pseudo-patients to be so severely ill that they were withholding information, the actual psychiatric inpatients were telling the doctors that the pseudo-patients were normal people. So today I'm going to argue that this Rosenhan experiment was anticipated in fictional, but basically identical form as far back as Hellenistic Greece, and specifically in a stage comedy titled The Menaechmus Brothers by Titus Maccius Plautus, Rome's greatest playwright. He lived 254 to 184 BC. Like all Roman comedies, The Menaechmus Brothers is a musical adaptation in Latin of a lost Greek comedy whose author and date are now unknown. This is it. As I aim to show, Plautus's play largely replicates Rosenhan's experiment in surprising and significant ways, and it suggests the contemporary concerns over the validity of psychiatric diagnoses were probably equally current concerns in both Hellenistic Greece and mid-Republican Rome, which is to say Rome around the year 200 BC. Less clearly, but more controversially, the play also seems to suggest that the validity of the entire medical model of madness, which is to say the belief today that mental illness is a bodily disease best treated with drugs, was a point of debate in these two societies. Since this dimension of the play has gone largely unappreciated, I'm trying to make a contribution to both the play and the history of medicine. So I want to begin by letting Rosenhan summarize his own experiment.
A different kind of criticism, but one that's just as provocative, has been leveled by David Rosenhan of Stanford University.
Between 1969 and 1972, a group of colleagues and I gained admission to psychiatric hospitals by faking a single symptom, which was that we said that we heard voices, and the voices said, empty, dull, thud. The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did. Admitted with the diagnosis in the main of paranoid schizophrenia, we were discharged with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in remission. Now, in remission doesn't mean quite the same thing as sane. The term we use to describe the experience is dehumanized. Nobody talks to you.
Okay, that's enough for now. What Rosenhan doesn't say here is that the pseudo-patients, as he called them, experienced considerable trouble in eventually getting out and getting permission to go back home. The lengths of hospitalization ranged from 7 to 52 days that they were kept in there. The average stay was 19 days long. Some of these pseudo-patients were nervous about lying to the admitting doctor, but apart from any signs of that, the alleged hallucinations were the sole reason for admitting them, that they heard voices. Each pseudo-patient gave a false name and job, but they otherwise gave true details about their lives, its ups and downs, their relationships, and their life histories. So published in the venerable journal Science, this experiment provoked a swift and incendiary reaction, and for several obvious reasons. Rosenhan was a psychiatric reformer, not a psychiatric atheist, so he predictably exposed himself to criticism on two fronts. An overwhelming first wave of criticism came from professional psychiatrists and mental health practitioners. They attacked his study as misguided or frivolous. An extended critique issued from Robert Spitzer, this gentleman, a psychiatrist at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. Several years later, he became the editor of DSM-3, which was published in 1980. These criticisms don't need to be repeated in detail here because if you aren't familiar with psychiatric controversies, the various points that they raise in opposition will suggest themselves to you instinctively. But the second and less obvious charge, which Rosenhan's study lay open, was that he hadn't gone far enough. This left him vulnerable to those critics who were skeptical of the pathological explanation of socially deviant behavior. That is to say, to critics who questioned the validity of the medical model of madness. This latter view is closely associated with Dr. Thomas Szasz, a professor of psychiatry at Upstate Medical School in Syracuse, New York, until his death some years ago. The thesis of his 1961 book, The Myth of Mental Illness, implies that if psychiatric diagnoses lack validity, as Rosenhan claimed, then that's simply because they're based on the false premise that mental illness is a medical illness at all. In Szasz's view, mental illness is merely a socially convenient metaphor for excusing or avoiding responsibility for other people's unwanted behaviors. So widespread acceptance of this view, as you can imagine, would imperil psychiatry overall. In the event, and I'll come back to this later, Szasz did publish an extended critique of Rosenhan's efforts. He did that in 2008, and we'll get to it shortly. So Rosenhan forestalled the second line of criticism by ignoring it. It's pretty effective. Instead of engaging with it, he offered a declaration of personal belief in the medical model as a sign of good faith. In the Science article, he states, quote, "Let me be perfectly clear about this. To say that psychological suffering is a myth is to engage in massive denial." In fact, that's not what Szasz argues at all, but the word myth in that quote is clearly an allusion to the title of his book, which Rosenhan never did mention. Rosenhan did respond to the first line of criticism, first piecemeal, and then later in Letters in Science, and then later in a more extended retrospective that came out 2 years later. In that retrospective, he articulated what he thought were the salient points of his study. He says the following: "The issue is not that the pseudo-patients lied or that psychiatrists believe them. The issue is not whether the pseudo-patients should have been admitted to the psychiatric hospital in the first place. The issue is the diagnostic leap that was made between a single presenting symptom, hallucination, and the diagnosis, schizophrenia. That's the heart of the matter." Yet despite his insistence here that his 1973 objection was limited only to a diagnostic leap, as he calls it, from single symptom to diagnosis, many readers, both lay and professional, still felt that insanity itself, and not merely its diagnosis, had been put on trial in his experiment. It's not hard to see why. First, there is the provocative title that Rosenhan gave his essay. As several critics immediately wrote in Science to object, sanity and insanity are legal concepts. They're not medical concepts. And yet here's a professional psychologist using them without any warning or apology, and doing so in the single most prestigious journal of the physical sciences. And then there was the preface that he led off the article with. Although Rosenhan stated that his aim was to reform and refine the precision of psychiatric diagnoses, and emphatically not to question the validity of mental disorder itself, he began his paper with a highly rhetorical and philosophical preface. It's filled with all kinds of provocative and borderline heretical suggestions about the nature of mental illness. He starts with an especially arresting question. He asks, if sanity and insanity exist, how shall we know them? He returns to these questions at the end of the article, where he concludes with a series of equally arresting observations and contentions. He says, we continue to label patients schizophrenic or manic depressive or insane, as if in those words, we captured the essence of understanding. The facts of the matter are that we've known for a long time that diagnoses are often not useful or reliable, but we have nevertheless continued to use them. We now know that we cannot distinguish sanity from insanity. How many people, one wonders, are sane but not recognized as such in our psychiatric institutions? How many people have feigned insanity in order to avoid the criminal consequences of their behavior? And again, he says, it's clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. The hospital itself imposes a special environment in which the meaning of behavior can be easily misunderstood. So it is, I'm arguing, precisely these concluding questions and contentions that are dramatized in Plautus's play, The Menaechmus Brothers. So let's turn to that directly now. Plautus's comedy is named for identical twin brothers, both named Menaechmus. Don't forget that. Identical twin brothers. It's not a good idea. Both named Menaechmus. One brother had been kidnapped at the age of 7. He was a 7-year-old. And he was brought to the Greek city of Epidamnus which is in Albania, basically, today, where he's since grown up to be about this age, in his 30s. And he now finds himself in an unhappy marriage. He lives in this town, and he's unhappily married. Meanwhile, the other brother had originally been named Sosicles, but upon the loss of their son, the first kid, Menaechmus, the parents decided to rename the other kid Menaechmus in honor of the kidnapped brother. So having grown up himself too, Menaechmus Sosicles has been scouring the world, blindly searching for his long-lost brother. And so today, which is to say the day of the play, he's arrived here in Epidemnus, the home of the first Menaechmus, and he's promptly mistaken by everybody in town for the local guy. So to minimize confusion, I'm going to refer constantly in this paper to Menaechmus Sosicles, the wandering brother, as simply Sosicles. But don't forget that in the play, both of these guys are both named Menaechmus, because if you don't know that, the play doesn't make any sense. Okay. Through a delightful series of coincidences and errors, the two brothers narrowly avoid meeting up or appearing on stage at the same time until the climax late in the play. In the interim, confusion rapidly compounds because nobody can figure out why Menaechmus, their good friend Menaechmus, is acting so strange or so inconsistent. What's remarkable is that characters in this play attribute each other's confusion to insanity. There's the Latin word, insania. They do it 35 times in the play. So this is an obvious theme in the play. Notably, too, and this is very important, some characters believe that sanity resides in the brain, and that insanity is a disease. The Latin word is morbus. In other words, these characters believe in what more or less all of us today would call mental illness. So the charges of insanity begin to fly the moment that Sosicles meets his first local resident here in Epidemnus. In separate encounters, he first runs into a cook, and then a courtesan, and finally a parasite, or an errand boy, that are all friends of the local Menaechmus. All three of them greet him warmly. They greet him by name, Menaechmus, and in the ensuing confusion, Sosicles or his manservant each accuses the other character of insanity. The cook also accuses them of insanity. Some charges are made in asides to the audience, but most of them are made to each other's face within the dramatic illusion. The action then takes an even more farcical turn, as Sosicles enters the house of the courtesan, the prostitute, by accident, because she says, "Come on in." And he gets to enjoy a free lunch and the remainder of the package deal at her house. And he comes out of the house, all giddy, comes out, and suddenly he finds his long-lost brother's wife standing there, and she's not happy. So this wife is furious at what she believes to be her husband's boorish behavior. So her enraged shouting brings us to the climactic scene of, that I want to look at with you now, that I'll call Sosicles as pseudo-patient. I'm contending that this and the following scene enact and anticipate a form of Rosenhan's experiment. So let me emphasize before we look at it that Plautus's play parallels Rosenhan's paper only in the first two of its three parts. Why? Well, because the third segment of Rosenhan's paper deals with the experience of ongoing hospitalization following psychiatric commitment. Mentally ill individuals were confined at home in Roman antiquity. There was no such thing as a mental asylum back then. There were not even prisons back then. So I'm passing over that part of the paper here. I'll come back to that issue of confinement toward the end, however. So as I said, Plautus's play, oops, I got a bit behind. Plautus's play parallels Rosenhan's paper in the following two parts. First is getting admitted. So just as Rosenhan and his pseudo-patients feigned hearing voices to gain admission to the hospitals, so too Sosicles has to feign hearing voices to convince his interlocutors that he's insane. The second part is going to be sanity on the ward. Just as Rosenhan and his pseudo-patients reverted to acting normal in talking to doctors on the ward, so too does Menaechmus revert to acting normal in talking to a doctor. And in his case, Epidemnus becomes effectively the ward itself. So let's look at the first part, getting admitted. Sosicles is trapped. Here he is. Who's this angry woman shouting at him? And now, she's called her dad to come and take action against him because she thinks he's a total bum and she's sick of him. She doesn't know what to do, so here comes father-in-law. Sophocles, of course, has no idea who she is, or when he arrives, why this father-in-law already knows his name. And worse than that, he can't think of any way out of this jam. But then, suddenly, he has a bright idea. He's going to decide to act crazy, and that'll scare everybody away. That's the only way he can get out of this. So he turns to the audience, he breaks the dramatic illusion, he looks at us, and he asks a rhetorical question. He says, let me see, where's our question? Over here. He looks at us and he says, since they're both declaring I'm insane, what better could I do than pretend I am insane and scare them both away from me? So he makes a point of asking us that directly. And already he's hearing voices. Now he can hear the god Apollo. Now he can hear the god Dionysus. Those are the voices of God, and they're telling him to get violent. We've seen these characters in the newspaper. And this threat of violence at last prompts the father-in-law to comment, good grief, this young man is ill and happy. So it's at this moment that the father-in-law, for the first time in the play, explicitly connects insanity, this idea of insanity, with illness. That is, he invokes and he subscribes to the medical model of mental illness. So alarmed and concerned, he runs off to get a psychiatrist, who is called in the play a medicus, a doctor, a medical doctor. So this scene corresponds to the first stage of Rosenhan's experiment, gaining admission to the hospitals. Recall what Rosenhan had said. The pseudo-patient arrived at the admissions office complaining that he had been hearing voices. They were often unclear, but as far as he could tell, they said empty, hollow, and thud. These voices were unfamiliar, and they were of the same sex as the pseudo-patient. So by his deception, pretending to hear voices, Sophocles has effectively gained admission. Now, of course, his alleged voices are divine in origin, and they're urging violence. But the general point's basically the same, namely that the feigning of auditory hallucinations alone, and nothing else, suffices to convince other people that a person is both insane and in need of medical treatment. So like the doctors in the pseudo-patient study, the father-in-law makes a diagnostic leap between the single presenting symptom and a layman's diagnosis of mental illness. So anyhow, off goes the father-in-law to go get the psychiatrist, leaving Sophocles at long last alone on stage. So he promptly makes a hasty escape. And I won't be talking about that guy again for the rest of the day. But the father-in-law, he soon returns with a psychiatrist who enters the stage a few minutes after him. The psychiatrist's entrance marks the beginning of a new scene, one that I call Sanity on the Ward. And it starts with a prelude. As he enters the stage, the psychiatrist lets us know that he's already heard from the father-in-law that Menaechmus is suffering from an illness. His word is morbus, disease. And though he hasn't met him yet, much less examined him, the psychiatrist is confident in his ability to treat this poor patient and to restore him to sanity. Take a look. The father-in-law says, please, please, make him sane again. And the psychiatrist says, of course, snap. You shall be sane. You have my word on that. Okay. And it's upon this pronouncement, he says, oh, here comes the patient right now. Here he is. He's walking in from the other side. So the patient, of course, as you might guess, is the long-lost identical brother, Menaechmus, the guy who lives in town. Menaechmus of Epidamus. He's a lawyer, and he's just come from a long day at the office. It's been a rough one. Since the two brothers have not encountered one another yet, he has no idea what's been happening all day long. But he does know one thing. It's been a really rotten day. He wasted a lot of time, and he missed some appointments, not least the date he'd made with that courtesan for lunch and a little extra. And he comes in, he says, this idiot client of mine spoiled everything. He says, I'm going to kill the ungrateful bastard. Poor, miserable me. So the father-in-law and the psychiatrist can hear all this ranting on the other side of the stage, and they decide that this is enough. They need to intervene. They need to find out what's going on. So the two of them hurry over to Menaechmus, and after greeting him by name, the psychiatrist starts his examination. So as farcical and as funny as they are, these conditions effectively replicate the second stage of Rosenhan's experiment. Recall that in the experiment, the pseudo-patients dropped the pretense of hearing voices as soon as they gained admission to the ward. They still had the same life stories, the same identities, and the same relationships, and they offered these details to doctors when they were asked. Yet, despite behaving entirely normally, they couldn't convince the ward psychiatrist of their sanity. As we're going to see, that's precisely the case with Menaechmus here. The only major difference is that Menaechmus is an unwitting pseudopatient rather than a deliberate fraud. And under the supervision of the psychiatrist, it's the entirety of this city that has become his ward. In fact, it bears noting that in this respect, Plautus's experiment is arguably more effective than Rosenhan's. In making use of identical twins separated at birth, but with identical names, rather than making use of conscious frauds to deceive the doctors, the Roman comedian precludes one of the potentially more cogent objections to Rosenhan's experiment. As one correspondent wrote into Science to protest, he says, the pseudo-patients, hold on, he says, the pseudo-patients did not behave normally in the hospital. Had their behavior been normal, they would have walked to the nurse's station and said, look, I'm a normal person who tried to see if I could get into this hospital by behaving in a crazy way or saying crazy things. It worked, and I was admitted to the hospital. But now I'd like to be discharged from the hospital. So we don't actually know whether such a ploy would have worked or not. But the analogous option was not possible for Plautus's involuntary pseudo-patient. But our focus here today is less on the pseudo-patient himself than it is on the doctor tasked with treating him. He too is in precisely the same position as the psychiatrist in Rosenhan's experiment. Let me quote from Rosenhan. Rosenhan says that given that the hospital staff was not incompetent, that the pseudo-patient had been behaving as sanely as he had been out of the hospital, and that it had never been previously suggested that he belonged in a psychiatric hospital, such an unlikely outcome would support the view that psychiatric diagnosis betrays little about the patient, but much about the environment in which an observer finds him. So by the way, it's been 45 years since this article came out, but clinicians keep coming up with the same conclusion. They keep finding this happening. A research article in Clinical Psychological Science came out just 2 months ago, and it concluded that when people encounter individual symptoms of a disorder, they're not interpreted independently of the surrounding context, but they're rather seen in the light of that context. In other words, these symptoms are not objective the same way the symptoms of diabetes are objective. And going back 2,200 years, this is exactly the case with Plautus's psychiatrist. From the questions he asks, scholars have proven that he is a model of solid Hippocratic learning, which is to say scientific medicine in the ancient world. And as we'll see, it seems to be the case that, as Rosenhan puts it, his psychiatric diagnosis betrays little about the patient, but much about the environment in which the psychiatrist finds him. So the similarity really is amazing. Like Rosenhan's psychiatrist, Plautus's psychiatrist, in effect, must diagnose and treat a schizophrenic malingerer. Do you know this word malingerer? Somebody who pretends to be sick for various reasons. He has to diagnose and treat a schizophrenic malingerer who's dropped all pretenses of abnormality. So let's see whether he can distinguish sanity on the ward. Or is it rather the case, as Rosenhan asks, do the salient characteristics that lead to diagnosis reside in the patients themselves or in the environments and contexts in which observers find them? So let's see how Plautus answered that kind of question. Recall that when the psychiatrist arrives on the scene, he already knows from the relative that his patient is insane. Menaechmus has, as it were, already been admitted to his care. So now it's the doctor's task to diagnose the illness. And he starts his examination in the following way. I'm not going to read it. We have 3 wonderful actors who have agreed to enact this scene and show us how it may have looked 2,200 years ago. So I'm going to step aside and make room for, first we have Menaechmus. This is Menaechmus after his long day at the office. We have our psychiatrist.
Me.
Yes? Okay.
Obviously not the father-in-law.
What's it? Not the father-in-law. Okay. Well, we don't, who knows? Yeah. And our father-in-law. Okay. So let's give them our attention.
Hello, Menaechmus. Oh, you've bared your arm. Why? Don't you realize how dangerous that is for your illness?
Get out of here! Do you notice anything?
I certainly do. This condition can't be relieved with an acre of hellebore. Do you drink white or dark wine?
Oh, go to hell!
By Hercules, he's already manifesting the onset of insanity.
Why not ask whether the bread I normally eat is crimson or scarlet, or even pink? That's like asking if I normally eat fish with feathers or birds with scales.
Good grief, do you hear the delirium he's spouting? What are you waiting for? Give him a dose of something before he goes completely insane.
Now, one moment. I will question him still further. Tell me this. Do your eyes ever normally get glazed?
What? Do you think I'm a lobster? You nincompoop?
Tell me, do you ever notice your bowels rumbling?
When I don't eat? When I eat well, they don't. When I'm hungry, they do.
Well, there's no indication of insanity in that reply. Do you sleep entirely through the night, or do you fall asleep readily on retiring?
I do if I've paid my bills. What is this questioning? May all the powers above blast you, you incompetent, inquisitive ass.
Now the man is beginning to manifest insanity. Those final words are proof.
Thank you. Yeah, don't go too far. We'll say that again. So, this is amazing. Scholars have studied this. The psychiatrist questions are all actually in line with standard Hippocratic medicine of the time, scientific medicine. But no matter the answer, as you see, Menaechmus can't win, especially when he questions the competence of the doctor himself. His gestures, his perplexity, his irritation, his frustration, especially his anger, all of these are taken as symptomatic of an abnormal mental condition. Yet even his cooperation and compliance are too. Compare what Rosenhan says in his study. One tacit characteristic of psychiatric diagnosis is that it locates the sources of aberration within the individual, and only rarely within the complex of stimuli that surrounds him. Consequently, behaviors that are stimulated by the environment are commonly misattributed to the patient's disorder. And so we see, despite clear evidence to the contrary, when he said, well, it never occurs to Plautus' psychiatrist to conclude there's nothing medically, that is, bodily, wrong with the patient. Rosenhan again says, physicians operate with a strong bias toward what statisticians call the type 2 error. That is to say, physicians are more inclined to call a healthy person sick than a sick person healthy, a false negative type 1. So it is in the Menaechmus Brothers, as we see in the final line that we just heard. Despite his initial caution, Plautus' psychiatrist is ultimately more inclined to call a healthy person sick than a sick person healthy. The type 2 error bolsters his belief that he can cure Menaechmus, and it dictates the therapy he now goes on to prescribe, namely involuntary commitment and a course of psychotropic drugs. Can we have our three actors again, please? Oh, you just need to stand up.
You guys sit around and look angry?
Well, you are fearful or
What's your motivation?
I want to be around you.
For God's sake, Doctor, whatever you're going to do, hurry up and do it. Can't you see this man is clearly insane?
Do you know what you had best do? Have him delivered to my place. There I'll treat him as I deem best. I'll have you drink hellebore for some 20 days.
Thank you. All right. What's hellebore, you ask? Hellebore was the Prozac of antiquity. And the doctor's decision to administer it bears comparison with the bombshell revelation that Rosenhan makes about the treatment he and his pseudopatients received while in the hospital. He says, all told, the pseudo-patients were administered nearly 2,100 psychotropic pills. Powerful medicines, 2,100 pills. So the decision in this play to have Menaechmus involuntarily committed to his care and treated with those kinds of drugs completes the psychiatrist's diagnosis. So I imagine the audience is convulsing with laughter 2,200 years ago at this scene. But just in case we miss the horror of what has just transpired, that is to say, a medical diagnosis tantamount to schizophrenia, followed by coercive commitment and drugging, all in the name of therapy, Menaechmus suddenly caps the scene by breaking the dramatic illusion again, much as his brother Sophocles had broken the dramatic illusion earlier. He turns to us now, out in the audience, and he asks us a question. He says, can it be that those who wrongly say I'm insane are really insane themselves? I don't think that's a purely rhetorical question. It invites serious moral reflection and discussion, if not right now in the middle of the performance, and if not ever allowed with other people and publicly, then certainly it's an invitation for some self-reflection, to think for yourself. Moreover, it's of a piece with the conclusion along similar lines that Rosenhan drew from his own experiment. Rosenhan said, as I told you, it's clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospital. The hospital itself imposes a special environment in which the meaning of behavior can be easily misunderstood. So what can we conclude from this? Can it be that those who wrongly say I'm insane are really insane themselves? This capping question of Menaechmus highlights not one, but two ethical reflections on the nature of madness. On the one hand, with the word wrongly, it challenges the validity of psychiatric diagnoses. It calls attention to the social context in which these judgments are made, and it dramatically demonstrates that special environments can be imposed upon individuals in which the meaning of behavior can be easily misunderstood. On the other hand, with the words, they're really insane themselves, it points the way to a more sweeping criticism of the medical model of mental illness, and especially how that model relates to power and coercion. So in retrospect, we can see how the first reflection was encoded in the play from the beginning and how it worked itself out as the action developed. So the creative genius of the playwright, the Greek comedian, whose play Plautus adapted as the Menaechmus Brothers, and who devised those two scenes we just saw, was twofold. First, this playwright hit on the very same idea of pseudo-patients, using pseudo-patients as a means of testing the validity of psychiatric diagnoses that Rosenhan hit on independently 2,000 years later. The comedian made a malingerer pretend to hear voices, and nothing more than that, to gain admission to a medical ward. Upon admission, the malingerer dropped the ruse. But even so, nevertheless, the psychiatrist failed to correctly diagnose him as free of bodily illness. The comedian's second stroke of genius lay in realizing that a plain old comedy of errors, of mistaken identity, could be adapted for this scenario to replicate these so-called laboratory conditions of the experiment. Now, mistaken identity is one of the most common themes in Greek New Comedy. We have 8 examples, or 15 examples, I think, 15 examples at least, and there were surely more. So by writing a play whose scene he set outside the usual venue of Athens, where it normally took place, and by making an unknown traveler arrive there, the comedian could actually create a sort of insane place. So in other words, the comic poet did something extremely creative. He united 2 different lines of thought. The first was mistaken identity. And he united the matrix of mistaken identity with the matrix of fears that psychiatric diagnoses of insanity lack validity. The common element of these 2 concepts, as we can now see, is the difficulty of telling 2 things apart. Whether that means distinguishing one identical twin from another, or distinguishing a sane person from an insane person. In fact, retrospect helps us see that this theme, though it's obscured by jokes and wordplay, was put on prominent display in the prologue to the play. Let me just show you a bit. In the prologue, he says, 2 twin sons, so alike in appearance that their foster mother couldn't distinguish them, nor could their real mother who gave them birth. So they were that alike. take a look here. Couldn't distinguish them with some of the language Rosenhan uses in his study. Rosenhan says, however much we may be personally convinced that we can tell the normal from the abnormal, the evidence is simply not convincing. We now know that we cannot distinguish insanity from sanity. It's clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals. These are all ways of expressing in English the same thing that Plautus calls in Latin non inter nos se posse, a little jingle, that means the inability to distinguish. And I'd like to suggest that this connection was even clearer in the Greek play, which we don't have, it's lost, but in the Greek play that this was adapted from. And the reason is because in the Greek language, the verb diagnoskein, which gives us the English word diagnosis, fundamentally means to tell apart, to distinguish two things. That's what diagnosis means. So let's now turn very briefly to the more sweeping criticism implied by the words, they're really insane themselves. I alluded to that 5 slides and a couple minutes ago. In his 2008 critique of the Rosenhan experiment, Thomas Sass exposed a fatal flaw in the logic of everything I've just presented to you. He says, finally he's being sarcastic, finally Rosenhan rediscovers psychiatry's oldest problem, false commitment. How many people, one wonders, are sane but not recognized as such in our psychiatric institution? He thus reinforces the legitimacy of depriving people of dignity and liberty, provided they really have real mental illnesses. Let me read that again. He thus reinforces the legitimacy of depriving people of dignity and liberty, provided they really have real mental illnesses. But his premise reeks of the odor of bad faith. Rosenhan identifies himself and his fellow frauds as sane pseudo-patients, and the other inmates in the hospital as insane real patients, even though the latter were diagnosed as insane by the same psychiatrists whose inability to make such a diagnosis Rosenhan claims to have demonstrated. You got that? Let that sink in. This suggests, or it might suggest, that only a call for an end of coercive psychiatric treatment rather than psychiatric reform was an appropriate recommendation for Rosenhan's study. But Rosenhan was seemingly, or perhaps only publicly and professionally, oblivious of the double bind in which his experiment left him. So the question is, did the author of Plautus's play, like Sass but unlike Rosenhan, realize the potential extent of the problem? My answer is yes, I think he did. Why? Because from time immemorial, popular thought in Greece and Rome attributed mental abnormality, as inferred from behavioral deviance, to divine intervention. We know this phenomenon, it emerged again in the Middle Ages and the early modern period of Europe, when the belief came back that witches and possession by Satan or Jews were responsible for mental abnormality, as inferred from behavioral deviance. In the 5th century BC, however, Hippocrates, the famous Greek doctor, he introduced a new explanation for strange behavior, the medical model that we're all familiar with. That's the model that attributes mental abnormality or behavioral abnormality exclusively to natural bodily causes. So in the Menaechmus Brothers, Sophocles plays on the popular model by feigning that his hallucinations come from the gods. But the comedy is ultimately concerned with this new scientific medical model, and specifically whether or not it makes any sense. So alarmed at his supposed son-in-law's erratic behavior, the father-in-law calls a doctor for help. Think about that for a second. Alarmed by his son-in-law's erratic behavior, he calls a doctor. So the relative is attributing his son-in-law's misbehavior to a bodily illness. It didn't have to be that way. He could have called the cops to arrest Sophocles, or he could have called for a ritual healer. Plautus's play itself had earlier shown that shamanistic cures like that were still in use. Much as in Europe, as I said, 15 centuries later, shamanistic cures like holy water came back into use for casting out demons. Arriving in Epidamnus and greeted as familiar by a stranger there, Sophocles had recommended that very sort of cure. He ran into a guy, and Sophocles had said, "Please, young man, how much do pigs cost here? Unblemished pigs for sacrifice." And the stranger says, "Well, they're $1 each." And Sosicles says, "Well, here's $1, take it. Go have yourself purified at my expense. I'm totally certain you're insane," you see. So those cures were also going on. Yet the father-in-law summons a doctor, a physician, the kind of professional who sets broken bones and conducts Hippocratic examination. And so that suffices to show that Plautus's soul healer is thoroughly medicalized. Just as soul healers in contemporary Western societies like the United States in 2017 are thoroughly medicalized. The father-in-law, too, has internalized the belief that bodily medicine is the proper treatment for troublesome behavior, just as virtually all members of virtually all contemporary societies believe bodily medicine is the proper treatment of troublesome behavior. Certainly it's the belief of the government, certainly it's the belief of our insurance companies. This is the point that you have to grasp clearly and not lose sight of. This play must have seemed extremely strange in the Renaissance when they rediscovered it. It would have seemed strange in the original context, and also strange to Christian readers in the early modern period, who, when belief in supernatural causes of social deviance had reemerged. And they were seeking soul therapies from priests and clerics, not from doctors. Recall that Menaechmus is a lawyer. He's in an unhappy marriage. He's been complaining about unrewarding professional relationships. Like many modern psychiatrists, this Plautus' soul doctor resorts to drug therapy to treat these fundamentally social issues, the kind that Thomas Sauce regularly called problems in living. What's more, we shouldn't fail to notice that the psychiatrist's therapy involves coercion. Later in the play, he has Menaechmus, as we saw, involuntarily committed to his care, against his will, with the full approval and the urging of his father-in-law, and he departs to prepare what he calls the treatment. Shortly later, we don't see this, men arrive to carry Menaechmus off by force, strong men, to pick him up and carry him off. And in the sequel, he's spared from this only by the arrival of his manservant who fights them off with a stick in a very exciting scene. So the farcical scene is Plautus' way of making the very same point that in my opening quotation, Gary Greenberg referred to as contemporary psychiatry's dirty secret. He had said that for all their confident pronouncements, psychiatrists can't rigorously differentiate illness from everyday suffering. So despite the similarity of this epistemological language to Rosenhan's above, Greenberg isn't saying that psychiatric diagnoses lack validity. He's saying that the medical model of mental illness is a category error, like calling a whale a fish. A whale's not a fish. It sure looks like one. Greenberg is saying that the medical model of mental illness is a category error. Mental anguish, loneliness, guilt, unhappiness, dissatisfaction, loss of autonomy. These things should those things be treated with neuroleptic drugs? And should an unwilling patient be forced to take them? So there are some corollaries very, very briefly. Doubts in the validity of Hippocrates' medical model of insanity, that is, disapproved behaviors whose origins other people, usually members of a family, attribute to psychic disturbance. Those doubts were probably born in the same instant as the model itself. It's therefore not surprising to see a social commentary on them lagging the widespread adoption of Hippocrates' teaching by about 80 years, which is about the time that the Greek play first came out. We can speculate, but only speculate, that the comedian maybe took these doubts from the critique of Stoic epistemology that had been developed in these times by the philosophical school known as academic skepticism. I could go into detail on that if you're interested. More important, though, the Menaechmus Brothers' dramatization of the Rosenhan experiment constitutes the first and probably the only indication that there was a debate in antiquity over the validity of diagnosis of mental illness or the validity of the medical model of mental illness. So far I've spoken of Greece, but the real question is Rome, where this play was staged, a nation across the sea that spoke a different language. When Plautus' lifetime, some forward-thinking Romans were abandoning traditional Roman cures for this faddish Hellenistic medicine coming out of Greece. It would be as if we all decided to give up Western medicine and switch over to acupuncture. They had a debate like this happening in his very own time, and it was coming from Greece. So if Romans were as anxious about that kind of idea, about Greek medical treatment of the mind as they were with other aspects of medicine, it may well explain why Plautus went and found this play, dusted it off, and refreshed it for a new audience in his society. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
questions?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
All right. Any questions out in the audience? Right over in the end.
Yeah. Could you speak up, please?
So you mentioned in history that there are a lot of cases where there are a lot of false positives. So do you think that's still the case today? And if we misplace all of us in psychosis, or there will be diagnoses?
Okay, so the question, if you heard it, is I mentioned that false commitment has a long history. These exposés go back all the way at least to the 1700s, when asylums they first emerge in Europe, and people going in and saying there's nothing wrong with these people. So that definitely has a long history. You ask whether it's happening today. I'm going to answer you in two ways. One, I'm not a medical professional, so I really don't know because I haven't been allowed to go in there. What I will tell you is this. There still are no objective criteria, bodily criteria, to make these diagnoses. Yeah, for example, the popular theory for depression today, anybody heard of the chemical imbalances? You heard of it? That idea is being discarded by psychiatrists right now. What's interesting is it's the Greek explanation, the bodily humors being out of whack. This is a very old idea which was discarded in the 19th century. Now it has come in through the back door. But when those diagnoses are made, no one's ever given a chemical test. I mean, it's diagnosed on the basis of behavior. So until it is based on a chemical test, you wouldn't be able to tell. So whether there's false commitments or not, you'd have to ask other people.
Steve.
Yes.
I'm interested in the social psychology side of the Sane problem. It seems to me that human communities are usually very conformist, very conventional, very sensitive to deviance, anomalies in individual behaviors, and always about to break into hysteria about deviance. And I wonder if you see that in powers too. Is that one of the subjects, the sensitivity of the community that sort of allows to handle something they don't understand is happening?
So it's a terrific question. I wish I did. I think the opposite. I think it's a very conservative playwright. These playwrights got their contracts from the state. And so this was mass entertainment at state festivals. And if you, he wrote at least 21 of these plays, according to some people, 120 of them. And so if you want to be a popular entertainer, you tend to be more conservative or at least circumspect about politics. And so I don't see evidence that he was trying to warn against that. No, I mean, this would be as close as it got. I wonder what you think of the idea that ancient playwrights and social psychology are the same thing, though. I've been backing into this idea that social psychology is ancient playwriting done in laboratory conditions. That's going to make some people unhappy that I say that. But I wonder, so there's a play by Plautus called The Captives, and it replicates the experiments of the Stanford prison experiment right down the line. It's unbelievable. And so the title refers nominally to a couple of people that are taken prisoner of war, but it seems to refer to everybody that is swept up in this system of guards, slaves guarding other slaves, and saying that we shouldn't be doing this. So I would come at it from a slightly different angle.
I mean, I understood that psychiatrists do a lot of false diagnoses, but there's still a lot of achievements on psychiatrists. Is it to emphasize on their faults?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the last part. You understand they made a lot of false diagnoses, but
But they made a lot of achievements too.
a lot of achievements.
Yeah, but like they to emphasize on their faults.
Okay, so the question was, psychiatrists, you said, made a lot of false diagnoses, but they have also had a lot of achievements. The way that Thomas Sauce, the real critique, and Greenberg, these other people, the way they address the issue you're saying is the only way to handle these problems is whether you voluntarily want to take, how you want to treat the problem yourself. So they said whether it's good for you or bad for you to take medications or drugs or whatever, should be something you yourself decide rather than your mom or dad or your spouse or something like that. And so they said the only fundamental way to decide if it's good or bad is coercion. So if it's a choice you make yourself, and you can see the catch that this gets you into, because if you think people don't have autonomy because they're crazy, then you need to do it for them. But as you say, humans are very conformist, so the more somebody deviates from regular behavior, especially if you love that person, the more you feel the need to exercise control over the other person. It is a remarkable thing. Most people on psychotropic drugs don't want to take them because they don't think they're crazy. Other questions? Yes.
So, kind of doing off of this question or response to this question, I'm wondering if you believe in madness at all, or if you, because I kind of get the feeling that you don't think madness or insanity can be determined objectively. If it's a voluntary, I want help, then that's the subject asking for help. So we shouldn't leave that to objectivity to the side.
So, okay, the question was, do I believe in it? Certainly, I see it. It's real. So, psychosis, you mean, and that's, or cries for help. Yeah, what these critics are saying, as I understand, is all that behavior is real. But there's nothing wrong with their body. There's nothing wrong with their brain. There's something wrong with their life. And it is a cry for, it's a drama in real time. Someone saying, speaking in metaphors, saying, I need help for this or that. But it's because they have problems in their life, not because their brain is not misfiring the same way it would be with, say, epilepsy. And it's not objective the way an epileptic shock is. Something wrong with that. Or if somebody has depression, they're deeply unhappy, but sometimes, or according to these critics, in every case, it's because something is wrong with their life, not wrong with their brain. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, but you don't think that there's any biological contribution to depression?
Well, so there's a biological contribution to everything you do, isn't there?
Right.
It's like watching a TV program. The metaphor would be like, if you don't like what's on TV, you can unplug it, or you can change the channel. It's the same with your brain. I mean, you need your brain to see, but that doesn't mean vision. It's fundamentally a product of your brain, does it? Your life is a product of your brain. So,
for those of us who have family members who have suffered psychosis, I can understand that a psychiatrist may not be able to know everything else, but for those of us who know, we know that there's something wrong, and that there's more than just life circumstances. So how would you respond to that? I think the experiment was not talking about people with recognizable psychoses, just how they are apprehended by the profession.
So this is the toughest question of all, and I've asked a lot of people about this. I had a chance to give a version of this at a couple of psychiatry departments, and this question always comes up. How do you help people? And this is, so what Sass said, this guy, he said, they don't want your help. That's an extremely cruel answer, but he thought it was the right one. I don't know that I would agree with that. And so the problem is with Alzheimer's, when someone dies, you can autopsy the brain and you see the plaques in the brain. When a schizophrenic dies, you cut open the brain and it's normal. Okay, you're going to object. Let me hear it, and then I'll give you your... Okay.
We now have ways to see in neuroimaging. We can see markers of schizophrenia, and even to some extent of things like autism and depression and anxiety. We can see physical markers of those now. It was very different, obviously, during Sass's time. In the 70s, we didn't have that. We do now.
Can I ask you a question then?
Yes.
Why is the diagnosis not made on the basis of those scans?
Because of political issues.
What's the politics at issue there?
Replication.
But if it doesn't replicate, it's not science. So if you are right, and this argument actually has been going on since the 40s and the 50s. If you are right, and I think it would be wonderful, then the diagnosis must be made on the basis of those scans and nothing else. Or else we're not talking about the same thing. Because you can't tell the difference between somebody feigning it and somebody...
We can't, but we can. We're trained to do that. We're trained in assessment methods to be able to do that. I think what you're taking away a lot of the objectivity that we actually do have now.
Okay.
We do assessments that are very objective, and we know ways to detect malingering. Yeah, we're not always perfect, but medicine's not always perfect. And so I think you're kind of, in a way, way not giving the psychology and psychiatric community enough credit.
Well, I don't mean to in any way show disrespect, but I do want to, I'm going to have to disagree with you. If the diagnosis of schizophrenia is not already itself made on the basis of a problem with the brain, we don't have a set of schizophrenics to begin with. Those diagnoses are based on behavior, but you can pathologize any grouping of behavior. All of the pathologies that are today medicalized are characters in Greek tragedy.
But isn't it somewhat circular to say that behavior is not legitimate if you're criticizing the medical model for facing and using in a physical change anyway? Behavioral symptoms are relevant regardless of whether they can be instantiated and measured by somebody's body, right? So to the extent that hallucinations occur, is that not something that's relevant to recognize or measure or treat?
Hallucinations that are self-reported, if a person is seeking help, then yeah. But if the person is being brought against their will, would you treat someone against their will? We don't do that in other branches of medicine. This alone does. And the question is, if talk therapy is as effective as the drugs, it's not in every case. I know it's a difficult conversation, but some of the psychiatrists are saying that the talk therapy is much more expensive. If it works at all, then it should be telling us that talk therapy is not effective with cancer. Talk therapy is not effective with diabetes. Why would it be effective in this case? These are the questions that are asked, and I see more challenges. So yeah, I expect these, and I do mean to be as respectful as I can. Please, who was first?
My question is that the patient does not want to be helped, but if somebody that is either causing serious bodily harm to themselves or has the potential to do so to others, where's the line?
Yep. So that is the ultimate line. That's a political question, and I agree with you. Where's the line? Where do we stop people? At Cornell University, where I work, they put up suicide nets. They're called over the gorges. They're beautiful rock gorges, very steep, and the students were jumping off of them and killing themselves. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants it. But so they put up suicide nets, and a lot of people thought it was a total waste of money, would never work, and it cut down on at least the spectacular suicides, which seemed to be a metaphor, a cry for help. And so but I agree, that's a political question or a social question. Where do we draw the line? Rather than a question of bodily illness, which is the only
It's like when you have a family member or something that is seriously ill, you can see them dying right in front of your eyes, and they do not want help. Do you just sit there and let it happen, or you try to do everything that you can for that family member?
I think those are the right questions to ask. I don't know that I can answer them for you, but I think those are the questions to ask.
Not so much a psychiatric question as a medical question, but based on the campaigns that you guys were talking about with the brain scans and mental illness and what's really going on, what was that say about pain? Because doctors treat pain.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. There's no way to say what it is with the brain scan. You can see areas bring it up. So the argument pain doesn't really exist.
So Sauce's answer, the question is pain versus the difference here is that people tend to seek help for their pain, whereas they tend not to seek help, except for depression, they tend not to seek help for mental illness. Typically, the typical scenario for mental illness is a family member brings another person in or nags another person to seek help. Pain, people seek help for the pain. So that was why Sauce said the only question can be one of coercion. Even if you think it's a bad idea to let somebody do something. He was a libertarian through and through, and he believed that was the only way to decide the question. But pain is real. I mean, we all know pain is real. Suffering is real. But the question is, what's the cause?
But could part of mental illness be the inability to recognize that you need help?
That's the classic answer. And the other question, though, one reason I got into this is I was fundamentally interested in the witch trials in early modern Germany in the 1600s. Thousands of people burned at the stake for practicing harmful magic on other people. So I thought if I lived in Germany in the early 1600s, I would know for sure that I have an immortal soul that could be compromised, hurt by other human beings. So it doesn't seem likely that human beings have freed ourselves from all the giant mistakes of our worldviews. So could this be one of them? I don't know. But before, in Greece and Rome, they seem to have a different view. They believed in philosophy as a practice that could issue these concerns. Now, in the United States, those statistics I gave you at the beginning, 1 in 4 women at least taking a pill. you don't see that replicated in other societies around the world. We didn't see that happening here in the United States 100 years ago. We have seen women's liberation expand massively, and you could say with massive liberation comes massive unhappiness. That could be one explanation. By the way, I realize all of this is very sensitive stuff, and so I don't mean to cause excessive offense. But are you puzzled? You look puzzled when I say that.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, my mind was thinking about people, women for women, because you said one of the things they don't see, but I know a substantial number of people who sought mental health, the majority of those for depression.
Sure.
Sought medication for that.
Yep.
And so, you said pain is different because people seek treatment. So
you're right. Depression is that is where most people are now voluntarily seeking it. And that's where, again, the Rosenhan himself, they said, if you want this kind of treatment, you should absolutely be free to have it. But what's interesting in the United States is we criminalize some drugs and we baptize others. So if you buy the drug at CVS, it's medicine. If you buy it on the street, it's harmful. It's an illegal drug. And what's the chemical difference between those two? Sometimes there's not much. So these are fundamentally, again, political questions rather than some other kind of question. That's
I have one more question, and then if anyone wants to come down after the questions to talk to the speaker, continue, and all that good stuff, that can continue on.
I just have one question about when you speak of like women and going to seek help, and so often, women are medicated for anxiety and depression when they actually have physical symptoms that represent something else. So why are we looking at these physical symptoms if we say that they don't even correlate with the mental illness?
What symptoms do you mean?
Like, if a woman is anxious, like she'll be diagnosed as anxious when she's feeling like nausea often and things like that, rather than like seeing if there's something intestinally wrong.
So I see. So I think typically your body is examined. If you seek help, they do examine your body, right? So I don't have the experience that you're alluding to myself. But if you were to go to the doctor with stomach pain or something like that, you're saying they're given medicine to treat anxiety.
Rather than the actual physical ailment that they may have.
Well, that would be incompetence. If they have if they have cancer of the stomach and they're being given anxiety, that's incompetence. I would seek a second opinion for that for sure. I mean, nobody should miss that that diagnosis. But typically, I think these diagnoses are ruled out when there's nothing wrong that people can detect with the body. And in that case, again, if you are seeking that kind of treatment, you should be free to do so. I mean, that is how our society sets it up. You ought to be free to do that. If you don't want that kind of treatment, it's especially tough when we deal with children, right? Because we have to make these decisions for them. Very difficult conversations. Those are political questions. People need to decide. It's family questions. They need to decide. Thank you.
All right. One more round of applause.